Welcome to part 4 of our Ph.D. webinars on copywriting. In this webinar, we focused on different models for the narrative structure for a Kappe. Understanding that writing is a process is something that's going to help you to become a better writer, and that's because the final product that you write, in this case your Kappe, is reliant on a lot of various different stages that are going to occur throughout your Ph.D. And these include the pre-writing stage, the cycle of writing where you draft and revise your ideas, the editing stage where you're going to end up correcting many of the errors or make small changes to the drafts that you have produced, and finally formatting for submission. One major issue that many people face is not properly dividing this process and dedicating enough time to the pre-writing stage. And it can become very challenging if you're trying to still conduct these aspects of pre-writing while you are also trying to draft, revise, and edit at the same time. So developing a good structure for your Kappe really begins here, and it's important that you have fully thought through everything in the pre-writing stage before you begin moving forward. And that's because the pre-writing stage is really where a lot of the hard work into developing our Kappe is going to be. Very much like a blueprint, having a good outline and fully thinking through the pre-writing stage will allow us to understand the different connections that we're trying to make, as well as the different structures that need to be within the blueprint. I like to use an image like this to demonstrate that a logical house construction has entranceways that move smoothly from room to room, connecting them in a logical manner, and that your house has all of the necessary rooms to make it a functional house. Now, the structure of a house can vary, and blueprints for a house will vary as well. But the main idea is that every good architect and every good contractor will be working off of a blueprint to help guide them towards what their finished product is going to be. And that's no different for us when we're writing our Ph.D. Kappes either. And a good starting point is to know the rules and know the regulations around what must be included or what must be expected. This is a lot like knowing the building codes for constructing a new house. So knowing the guidelines and the regulations for what your Kappe must have is a good way to start designing a framework and a structure to work within. And of course, a good starting point is to do your own homework on your own department. What are the different expectations of a Kappe, and what are the different guidelines or regulations for what must be included in a Kappe? Now, of course, not every department has clear guidelines for you to be able to follow. So if you cannot find clear guidelines, I suggest that you speak with your supervisors, the head of your PhD program, or PhD student advisors to help clarify what is expected and what is required for a Kappe's structure. And that's because there are some fundamental requirements, like the number of publications for an acceptable Kappe, knowing what the minimum number of manuscripts is, knowing what the maximum number of manuscripts is. It's also important that you understand what permissible genres or types of manuscripts can be included. Are you able to include things like commentaries, literature reviews, discussion or reflection papers, letters, and what about non-peer-reviewed works like book chapters or conference proceedings? You should also know the publication status. How many of your manuscripts actually need to be published? And at what state of publication should any of these manuscripts be in for your Kappe to be deemed acceptable? You should also know about the regulations surrounding co-authorship. Is there any limit to the number of co-authored manuscripts that can be included in your Kappe? And how many of those manuscripts must you be a lead author on? You may also want to investigate requirements surrounding language. Is English or a Scandinavian language accepted for the final Kappe? And is it possible that your Kappe can mix languages, having manuscripts in a different language than the rest of the Kappe is written in? You should also think about copyright permissions. Do you need to obtain a copyright permission to publish your own manuscripts that have been submitted or accepted in a peer-reviewed journal for those manuscripts to appear in your own Kappe? And which version of a manuscript can you include in your Kappe? So, of course, if you have had a manuscript accepted for publication, you should know which version you are allowed to access and if there are any embargo periods on the published version. But of course, journals have the right to say no to you using your own published work, so do not assume that you can use a specific version of a manuscript in your Kappe. It's important you do your homework and that you get your permissions before you submit your Kappe, because copyright permissions can take time. And of course, you need to know what the requirements are for formatting, standard citations, referencing styles, font types, headings, subheadings, title page, and so forth. Knowing all of these things will give you a better idea of what needs to be included and how you can begin to structure your Kappe. And of course, a very common question is the word count. Does your Kappe have a minimum or a maximum length of pages or of words? And if not, unless it is stated, your Kappe should be as long or as short as needed to sustain and complete your scientific argument. Now, with all of the boring requirements out of the way, we can actually go in and look at the purpose of this webinar, which was designed to look at the narrative structure. And the narrative is something that we've been focusing on in the past 3 webinars in this series, but it's basically the logical and cohesive presentation of your research that demonstrates doctorateness and sustains a scientific argument for your research project. As a starting point, understanding the importance of structuring our ideas and evidence in an outline before we begin writing is a really great way to prevent a lot of writing challenges that will happen later as we try to move through writing our Kappe. But we also want to choose an appropriate structural model for our narrative to follow, because that will help us to begin to arrange and organize our ideas, our research notes, literature that we have reviewed, so on and so forth, to figure out the most appropriate way of presenting it for our readers. There's 2 common narrative structures that serve as great starting points for us to help us outline our Kappes, and they are as such: the sandwich model and the 2-part model. Let's first look at the sandwich model. It takes its name from the idea that your article manuscripts are sandwiched or contained within the Kappe's narrative, such as is presented here. Here we can see that the narrative starts with a section that could be considered the introduction, including problem statements, research questions, hypotheses, or thesis statements, any necessary background or literature review, theoretical or conceptual frameworks, and materials and methods. Our results section is ultimately the articles that we present ourselves before moving down towards our discussion and conclusion in what could be considered the second part of the narrative. Now, depending on how you want to structure your narrative, should you choose the sandwich model, you might want to consider about the order that you're going to present your articles. It might not always make the most sense to go sequentially. In fact, your narrative or the story and argument that you are constructing could benefit from a reordering of your articles if you think that it helps to create a better sense of flow for your reader. And of course, it might also be necessary to provide a summary of key results or key findings after you have presented all of the articles to make for a smoother transition into the discussion and conclusion section. And of course, the narrative is all about creating a sense of flow and transition to create one cohesive, sustained, and logical argument from start to finish. Now, of course, this is just one way that the sandwich model can be represented. You might also find it beneficial to see it represented like this. Now, on the other hand, the 2-part model contains all of the same components, but it separates the narrative from your manuscripts or articles. Basically, the 2-part model has the narrative as a standalone text that looks like this. It includes everything from introduction to the conclusion, with the narrative flow moving all the way through. However, we end up presenting the articles as part of an appendices. And the idea here is that the narrative is going to cite the articles, but the articles are not contained within the body of the narrative. So which structural model is best? Well, neither is better than the other. They're just different. And so it's ultimately going to come down to the regulations and expectations of the department that you find yourself under. Or if there is no explicit guideline stating which of these models you should follow, you should then choose which of the structural models makes the most sense for the way that you want to construct your narrative. Because the point of the narrative is to be able to lead our reader smoothly from introduction to conclusion in a purposeful and logical way. And a great way of doing that before we sit down to write our Kappe is to take the time to outline all of our ideas and figure out how we are going to actually structure how we want our ideas to be presented through either the sandwich model or the two-part model. Often it can be very beneficial for you to visualize how all of your Kappe's elements can fit together and how you want them to be arranged, because this visualization is not just helpful for you to determine which elements and components relate to each other in certain ways and how they should be presented, but is a very powerful tool to include for the readers of your Kappe to understand how all of your ideas are put together and connect to each other. So let's look at a couple of different models from some real-life presentations. In this case here, we can very clearly see a movement from the bottom up where the chapters are associated with different aspects, and we can see that this author has decided to go for the sandwich model. Now, of course, this doesn't make a lot of sense to us as a visual without being able to read the Kappe, but it is a good way of demonstrating how you can move through different ideas towards a general discussion, conclusion, and recommendations about this author's idea of sustainability and sustainable development. Perhaps you might appreciate structuring your outline more like this. This is also a sandwich model because we can see that the papers and the journal that they are included in are contained within the body. They are not within the appendices. There's also a model like this, and it's a bit difficult to tell just from the visual alone. However, I believe this is very likely a two-part model. We have an introduction and identification of the research gaps. We then have an overview, results, and discussion that is going to occur in here, followed by implications and conclusions, with the articles potentially being included in an appendix that is not shown in the visual. Now, here's a clearer example of the two-part model, and that's because all of this part here is the body, from preface and introduction through to discussion and conclusion, creating the narrative, but we can clearly see that manuscripts and supplemental information are contained in here, denoted by whether they are conference papers or technical reports as part of an appendices. So as we've mentioned in some of our past webinars, the narrative helps to tie all of the research together. And the Kappe is really a new narrative. We shouldn't just be copy-pasting text that we've already written in our articles or manuscripts. Those manuscripts are standalone documents, and the Kappe needs to work with all of these different elements to create a new narrative. And these different elements have different roles within our Kappe's narrative. But we're faced with many of the same familiar structural elements. We should have an introduction. Somewhere we should have some kind of a description of our research design. We'll need to include information about the materials and methods of our entire research project. We'll need to present our results, which is an overview of all of the articles or manuscripts that we have written. We can then move into a discussion, followed by a conclusion. Now, introductions place your work within the broader scientific field and positions your research relative to other research that is currently being done. It presents an overview of the research field that your examiners should hopefully be familiar with, but it also allows them to be grounded in the field enough to be able to understand where you are coming from and how you understand the field. It's also going to involve some form of a literature review because you'll be providing introductory or background information, citing other authors and other research to provide necessary background information. It's also going to identify problems, puzzles, or gaps which help to justify why your research is important, as well as include the questions or hypotheses that you have. The research design is a bit of a tricky one. Depending on the conventions of your field, you may or may not need to include information about your research design, but we can kind of consider it to be the aims of the study. You might not necessarily have, as I've mentioned, a chapter or a section called research design, but it might fall under background, aims of study, theoretical or conceptual framework. And all of these different sections could actually be sections or chapters of the introduction. And the point of being able to explain the aims of the study or the research design is that it allows you to explain all of the overarching research questions, the objectives, the actions that you have taken, and the goals or aims, the expected outcomes of your research, to the evaluation committee. The research design is also helpful for you to be able to identify the type of research that you have actually conducted. And it allows you to start from a zoomed out perspective with a zoom in towards your specific research questions and methods that you've applied to be able to create your intended contribution. We also come to this question of, do you need a theoretical or conceptual framework? Because this is also part of a research design. Now, not all disciplines will require this, but for those that do, a theoretical or conceptual framework chapter is useful to explain the different concepts and mechanisms that you're working with, as well as normative assumptions that are going to be embedded in your Kappe. So let's look at it this way. We need to be able to explain specific concepts and our understanding of them. For example, if you're relying on abstract concepts like literacy or community identity or resilience, these concepts can have multiple and different meanings, and you must distinguish which definition and meaning you ascribe to so that your readers understand how this concept is informed and how you will be using it throughout your Kappe. Mechanisms are the understanding of the underlying theories of how something operates or occurs. So, for example, if we're studying how learning occurs, then we actually need to have a theoretical mechanism for how that learning would occur. So what is your understanding of the theory that you are using? Where does this theory come from? How are you using it? And why do you think that it is valid to be able to explain your research? And of course, normative assumptions. What do you believe is desirable as an outcome, and why do you believe that this outcome is desirable? This is very much an aspect of social science research because we typically rely on normative assumptions about what is good or bad, or successful or unsuccessful. Again, let's take an example of learning. How would you describe successful learning? Well, to answer this, we also need to have an understanding of what makes good learning and what does success mean in the context of good learning. So it is these sort of normative assumptions that should be made explicit so that you can demonstrate how you are going to determine and evaluate what is good and bad outcomes in your research. Now, of course, not all Kappes will have a required or dedicated literature review or research design or theoretical or conceptual framework section. For many within the natural sciences, some of this will be wrapped up in your introduction instead, but it's still important that you're able to maintain cohesiveness between the concepts and theories that you're relying on that you present in your introduction to how these concepts and theories were applied in your research manuscript and how you're going to be discussing them in your Kappe's discussion and conclusion. The materials and methods section demonstrates cohesiveness between your research design, your research questions, and the methods that you've employed to answer those questions. This chapter really explains why the methods that you used fit to the purpose of your research design. Even if your manuscripts have dedicated methods sections, those methods chapters don't really have enough room if they were designed for publication and peer review to explain your methodological choices in relation to your research design. So in your Kappe, the materials and methods section is actually useful for you to talk a little bit about how you might have applied different methods across different manuscripts, to explain how a combination of methodologies may help you answer your overarching research questions, so on and so forth. This chapter is really useful to allow you to reflect on your methodological choices, to discuss limitations of the methods that you have employed, and to discuss any potential ethical issues that might have arisen. When we come to the results, just because your manuscripts also have their own results section doesn't mean that you should just summarize those results in isolation. The Kappe needs to create a cohesive link between your results from each standalone research article to your overarching research questions and research design for the entire PhD project. So you'll want to return to the research questions that you identified in the Kappe's introduction. You want to try and then demonstrate the significance of each paper, but don't simply copy the text from each abstract or from each results section. You really need to consider the significance of each of these papers in relation to your entire PhD's research questions and how all of these are going to fit together into your Kappe. One way that we can think about this is let's begin with a publication overview of the different articles, because this can also be useful for us to end up organizing our article overview section or the results section of our Kappe. We can basically create something like this that helps to visualize the title, the journal, the current publication status, and the authorship in a very simple and easy to understand way for our readers. It summarizes a large amount of information, but this is only the start. We also want to end up thinking about how the article overview provides integration of results for our Kappe. And basically what I mean by that is we want to think about how each article has key findings that can integrate towards answering overarching research questions that we were interested in our entire PhD. And a good way to do this is to summarize it and visualize our articles and the key findings of each article as such in relation to overarching research questions that we have for our PhD. And then we can point out how each article ends up linking to answer these different research questions. And by doing this, it's going to end up informing our discussion. Now, of course, depending on the model that you use, where you end up placing the results and this article overview is going to vary. As mentioned in the sandwich model, we probably want to have a section that introduces each article, but is also able to summarize the main findings of each article, and then have a section that summarizes all of the results across all of the articles to integrate them to make for a smooth transition into our discussion and our conclusion. Now, with a two-part model, this is going to be a little bit different, of course, because we're not going to include each article. Instead, we are just going to have a summary of each manuscript and the key findings, working to integrate those findings together as part of the narrative. And we are going to be citing the articles as the articles appear in a separate appendix. Now, a discussion is really no different from the manuscripts that you've already written, except we're using our own articles and their standalone findings to discuss how they integrate to answer the main research questions that we have presented from the Kappe's introduction. The discussion shouldn't only demonstrate how your cumulative findings work to answer your research questions and provide an original contribution to the discipline, but we also want to use this discussion to position our work relative to the work that others are doing within the scientific field. So what research findings have other people generated that either helps to explain or support your research findings? What other research demonstrates that your research contribution is helping to solve a problem, piece together a puzzle, or fill a knowledge gap? What emergent questions might have come out of your research that can be explained or supported by other people's research? And of course, what happens if your findings end up being different to the work of others? The discussion is intended to bring the reader full circle in the narrative, providing hopefully definitive answers or some further ideas about your research questions, and potentially shedding more light on further problems, puzzles, or gaps that require further solutions, further clarifications, or better understanding or new insight that's going to help to advance the field. We're trying to frame all of this inside of the discussion as our research contribution across all of the manuscripts that we have provided to create one clear, cohesive contribution to our discipline. Now, where should the results and discussion end up appearing? Obviously, this is going to end up depending on what is a common practice within your field, but also which model you follow. In the sandwich model, the discussion will typically appear after the articles or the manuscripts, whereas in the two-part model, the discussion is going to appear before a presentation of your articles or manuscripts. But it is possible for the results and discussion section to be merged in some disciplines, and it's important that you understand if that is the case for your department or not. And of course, now we finally come to a conclusion. Similar to the results and discussion merger, you may be expected in your department to merge the discussion and conclusion, or potentially to keep them separate. However this occurs, your conclusion will end up addressing the same research problems, puzzles, or gaps that you identified in your introduction, with the hopes of providing answers to the questions that had been asked at the start of your Kappe. We also want to try to use the conclusion to not only address the research questions or hypotheses presented in the introduction, but to position our research within the broader field and to demonstrate any contributions, implications, or new areas of research. With all of this in mind, we have a better understanding of how we can construct a good structure to outline our Kappe and be able to move forward into the other stages of the writing process, the drafting and revising, the editing, and the submitting.